Bun găsit la emisiunea Știință și Cunoaștere. Anul 2014 a debutat cu interviuri impresionante. La Știință și Cunoaștere vom aborda pentru prima dată domenii de avangardă precum paleolingvistică, paleopsihologie, istorie, istoria științelor, medicină mitocondrială și nanomedicină, noua ordine economică, sociologie, economie științifică și multe altele despre care cel puțin eu nu am mai auzit până acum. După difuzarea primului episod al interviului cu Mitchell Ledwith, în primele 3 zile statisticile YouTube îmi afișau cote rar întâlnite de audiență, aproximativ 1000 de vizualizări pe zi. Totuși, multe lucruri au rămas încă neelucidate după acea discuție de-a dreptul halucinantă de 4 ore. Domnia sa mi-a prezentat un comentariu de aproximativ 14 minute legat de istoria limbii și a poporului român, care se bazează pe o carte recent apărută sub semnătura unui profesor britanic de istorie pe nume Mark Pagel. În numeroasele mesaje de pe internet mi s-a cerut să iau legătura cu acest profesor și să programez un interviu pe această temă foarte fierbinte pe care domnul Ledwith a aprins-o în zona României încă din decembrie 2012 cu ocazia primului interviu și iată că flacăra vie acestui subiect continuă să ardă sub diverse forme pe internet, la emisiuni radio și TV. Am avut mari ezitări și chiar temeri în a face orice demersuri de a aborda probleme controversate ale istoriei României și limbii române, deoarece unele dovezi sunt insuficiente, iar altele lasă loc la prea multe interpretări, așa după cum ați putut sesiza cât de controversate sunt anumite texte biblice pe care domnul Mitchell le-a analizat cu bisturiul, dacă îmi permiteți această metaforă. Cunoștințele mele de natură științifică, în ciuda tuturor aprecierilor pe care dumneavoastră mi le-ați adresat pe internet, sunt limitate și trebuie să repet, sunt foarte limitate. Difuzarea primei părți a interviului cu Mitchell Ledwith m-a pus într-o situație dificilă în ceea ce privește abordarea unor domenii de știință și cunoaștere la care nu am nicio competență. Având însă la dispoziție întrebările dumneavoastră gata formulate, comentariile interesante de pe internet și un pic de noroc, am făcut un pas care mi-a adus informații speciale din domeniul istoriei și chiar mai mult decât atât mi-a adus o nouă viziune asupra înțelegerii istoriei. Am prins curaj, am căutat numărul de telefon al profesorului Pagel din Anglia și luni dimineața am sunat la birou. Nu l-am găsit, am revenit marți și apoi miercuri, desigur îi lăsasem și un mesaj pe adresa de e-mail, dar miercuri 5 martie 2014 mi-a răspuns la apel. Eram foarte emoționat și pentru ca să nu mă bâlbâi prea mult, aveam deja textul pregătit, bine conceput, pe care l-am trimis pe e-mail, așa că aveam o speranță. În câteva secunde mi-a oferit răspunsul că acceptă interviul și astfel temerile și emoțiile mele au dispărut brusc. I-am trimis întrebările care erau scrise deja de vreo 3 zile, a fost de acord cu toate, așa că mai urma să stabilim o zi și o oră de întâlnire. Ne-am conectat pe Skype și mi-a scris să revin peste 2 ore când va lăsa un mesaj cu toate detaliile. După 2 ore ne întâlnim pe Skype și mă întreabă ce părere ai avea să facem interviul chiar acum. Am rămas șocat, dar extrem de interesat să fac orice ca să nu scap o asemenea ocazie și l-am rugat să-mi lase la dispoziție 10 minute să-mi așez camera video, am instalat camera, am făcut reglajele și în aproximativ 5 minute, iar restul de 4 minute și 30 de secunde am scris textul de introducere și încheiere, deoarece din fericire întrebările erau deja pregătite. Cel mai tare m-a surprins însă această imagine gata încadrată conform standardelor, lumina gata reglată, sunetul s-a nimerit să fie exact la nivelul care trebuie, fundalul, totul era bine ales, iluminat, nu a trebuit să-i spun nimic în plus despre cum să fie iluminat și unghiul, doar ulterior, după primele 1-2 minute, am observat că nu privea direct spre camera web, așa că i-am sugerat să schimbe unghiul. Deci s-au nimerit toate aceste condiții tehnice pur și simplu fără niciun efort, pe lângă faptul că, după cum se poate observa, transmisia semnalului video a fost în formatul 16:9, specific celui de înaltă rezoluție. A urmat o discuție atât de interesantă încât nu găsesc cuvinte suficiente pentru a descrie acest fapt. Mai subliniez doar câteva date biografice. Mark Pagel este profesor la Școala de Științe ale Vieții, Universitatea Reading din Anglia. Mark Pagel construiește modele statistice pentru a examina procesele evolutive imprimate în comportamentul uman, de la genomică la apariția unor sisteme complexe și cultură. Ultima sa lucrare științifică examinează paralelele dintre evoluția lingvistică și cea biologică prin aplicarea metodelor filogenetice, studii de înrudire evolutivă în rândul grupurilor, limbajul fiind privit ca replicator transmis cultural cu proprietăți asemănătoare celor care definesc genele. Profesorul Pagel caută modele în ratele de evoluție ale elementelor de limbaj și el speră să descopere factorii sociali care influențează tendințele de evoluție a limbajului. Lucrează la Universitatea din Reading, unde e șeful laboratorului despre evoluție a Departamentului de Biologie. În cadrul activității sale, profesorul Pagel dorește să afle răspunsul la întrebări precum de ce vor oamenii să dezvolte un sistem de comunicare care, de fapt, le pune bariere în comunicarea cu alți membri din aceeași specie. Vă invit acum să vizionați acest interviu special cu profesorul Mark Pagel.
Hello, my name is Professor Mark Pagel from the School of Biological Sciences at the University of Reading in England, and you are watching Science and Knowledge on TVR Cluj, Romania.
Dear Professor Mark Pagel, welcome to our program Science and Knowledge here on TVR Cluj, Romania for the first time.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
It is an honor beyond words to have you as a guest in this special program.
Thank you very much.
Until now, we had reached unusual audience not only in Romania, where we air the program, but also on the internet, due to the fact that we do have simultaneously transmission both on web and on satellite.
Well, the people of Romania are very lucky.
Your work did something that will create an effect for generations, because we may now look upon the history of each people in a different manner, more organized, more clear, and favor the way to respect all human beings. What you are doing, and correct me if I'm wrong, you are creating a new way to look at ourselves and our beliefs and ancestral subconscious settings, which some of them should no longer be present and should get rid of them. It is a new kind of history, a multidisciplinary science.
Well, that's what we're trying to do. Yes, we're trying to achieve that.
Where were found the first human populations on Europe 15,000 years ago?
Well, what we know is that modern human beings, people like you and me, first entered Europe maybe 45,000 years ago. 45,000 years ago is a very long time ago, but we were very much like we are today. And modern humans lived in Europe for many thousands of years, and they eventually replaced the Neanderthals who had been there before them. And by the time we get up to around 15,000 years ago, modern human beings, people like you and me, would have been about the only human species in Europe. As I say, before that time, there would have been Neanderthals, and there would have even been this other species that was recently discovered called the Denisovans. But by 15,000 years ago, we were the only ones left.
How would you define the meaning of culture when talking about the human population which lived 15,000 years ago, or even many more years ago?
Yes, well, surprisingly, we can think of the cultures as very much like cultures today, in that just as today we create things and we hand information and knowledge and skills down from generation to generation, we were doing that 15,000 years ago. The big difference is that 15,000 years ago, all of us would have been hunter-gatherers. We were people who had to find all of our food by hunting for it or gathering it from the forest. We didn't have agriculture. We didn't have domesticated animals. So we were hunter-gatherers. And beyond that, we would have lived in small groups of people, maybe 50 or 75 people. But our cultures were, other than that, very much like cultures today, in that we lived and shared and cooperated with each other and handed down our knowledge and skills from generation to generation.
How many languages existed at that time, and why then they began to diverge into so many today?
Well, 15,000 years ago, probably it was the case in Europe that there were hundreds of different languages spoken by the different hunter-gatherer tribes that would have lived around Europe. But then what we think happened about 15,000 years ago was that a group of people emerged who would later spread out over all of Europe and Eurasia, and they would replace many of the speakers who were there at that time. And their languages will have been lost. So perhaps 15,000 years ago, there were hundreds of different languages in Europe, and then they would have been replaced by a spreading wave of people who arose about 15,000 years ago. And now those people have spread out all over Europe and Eurasia. And again, there are hundreds of languages spoken around Eurasia. It's just that all of those languages, we think, can trace their ancestry back to a common group of people who may have existed in sort of southern Europe and the Caucasus, not so far from Romania, maybe 15,000 years ago.
And were they some sort of proto-languages?
Yes, so we think that 15,000 years ago, there was a sort of proto-Eurasian language that would eventually give rise to all of the languages that we now see all over Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and further east into Eurasia, including the Slavic languages, some of the Siberian languages, the languages of Hungary and Finland, called the Uralic languages, and the Indo-European languages. We think they all arose from a common ancestor or proto-language that existed about 15,000 years ago.
Some scientists consider that the very first attempt of developing a language is older than 60,000 years, and it is called the Sand-Bushman Click language. Can you elaborate more?
Yes, I mean, the Sand-Bushman language probably derives from a language that was spoken maybe 75,000 years ago, maybe even 100,000 years ago. Now, what we believe about modern humans is that we have been speaking, that is, using language, ever since we evolved about 160 to 200,000 years ago. So we have had language ever since we have been modern human beings. And the reason we believe that is that everybody around the world speaks and speaks equally well. And so it's reasonable to suppose that the ability to have language arose with our species. And our species is about 160 to 200,000 years old. So languages have been spoken all of that time, and the Sand-Bushman Click language is the descendant of a very early language that might have been spoken, as I say, maybe 75 or 100,000 years ago. And we know that because the Sand-Bushmen are genetically distinct from many of us who live in Europe and outside of Africa, and their genetic differences to us tell us that they have been separated from us for maybe 75 to 100,000 years.
In Papua New Guinea, there is a rare phenomenon. On that territory, people are speaking over 100 or 1,000 languages.
Yes, that's right. And again, that's tribalism. All of these people are living in a very small area, and they're dividing the countryside up into little geographical segments, and they're excluding anybody else from coming into them. So they develop their own language, and they keep outsiders from coming in. And so everybody's language diverges. They all get very different because they're not listening to each other.
But that it is not a good thing, on my opinion. For example, if at any 10 people group from a population of 10,000, they speak another language.
Well, they might have, yes, I mean, they live in such small groups that there might be a different language spoken every 3 or 4 kilometers. Just extraordinary.
What is social learning? And please tell us the history of social learning.
Yes, I mean, all animals influence each other, and in a sense, all animals can learn from each other in a social context. But what I call social learning is something that's really unique to modern human beings, and that's that not only do we learn from others, we can actually quite accurately copy what others are doing, and we have a sense that we know why they're doing what they're doing. So if I watch two people and they're both trying to make a bow and arrow, and I notice that one of them makes a better bow and arrow than the other one, I will preferentially copy the one who's making the better bow and arrow. Now, as obvious as that seems to us, no other animal does that. No other animal recognizes that what the first one is making could be a good or a bad version. It simply sort of, in a way, is influenced by what that other animal's doing. So for us, social learning is this very precise copying of new or novel things that someone else can do. And what it means is that we can learn directly from each other new ways of interacting with our environment. And that's a very important difference between us and the other animals. Our knowledge and our wisdom and our skills accumulate over time because we can learn from each other, and no other animal does that.
Can you tell us more about the human population group which existed on our Romanian present territory?
It's very difficult to know. My understanding is that there is some genetic evidence that Romanian people trace their genetic ancestry back to is it the Daci people?
Yes, Dutch, Dacia, Romans.
Yes.
From Rome, you know.
And my understanding is that genetically Romanian people are descendant from the Thracian people.
Yes, we say Thracians, Jets, and we call them as being as Thracians Dacian origin.
Okay. And so, those people would have been living in Western Europe, many thousands of years ago. And if we go back further and further and further in time, maybe to 15,000 years ago, the people who were living around what is present-day Romania would have been hunter-gatherers who probably would have, by that time, had somewhat light skin, but not as light as we do today, because remember that we were descendants of people who had walked out of Africa, and our skin color was slowly changing throughout that time. So we would have been very much like we are today, but different in some respects as well.
Were their culture and language very different from the other groups in Europe at that time?
Well, if we go back 15,000 years, we really don't know if the people who were living in present-day Romania, if their language, how different their language was. There would have been languages spoken all over present-day Romanian. But what we can say is that their culture was probably very much like the other cultures that were in Europe at that time, in the sense that they would have been hunter-gatherers who lived from the forest. They would have killed animals, they would have collected vegetables and nuts, and they probably would have engaged in fishing. And this is what all people around that time were like. And so it's reasonable to expect that's what the people were like around present-day Romania.
Can you tell us why we are still culturally wired to some of those ancient and primitive aspects which at that time were necessary for survival, but in our present days they are no longer necessary?
Yes, I mean, one of the things about humans is that we are very tribal. We all know that. So we recognize people as being a member of our tribe if they speak the same language, for example. And we could say that in some ways that tribal nature that we have is slightly left over from an earlier time when we would have lived in tribal groups that were in constant competition with other tribal groups. And we have those characteristics because they're deeply wired into us genetically. And it's only been in very, very recent times that we have started to live in larger and larger groupings like big cities and so on. And so there simply hasn't been enough time for us to sort of lose that old-fashioned tribalism that would have been such an important part of our history.
Can you explain the tree of languages since 15,000 years ago until present time, emphasizing upon what evolved on the actual territory of Romania?
Well, what we can say is that at some time around 15,000 years ago, we think there was a proto-language that arose somewhere in southern Europe. And it might have been, Central Asia, southern Europe, the Caucasus, maybe present-day Georgia. We don't really know for sure, but somewhere around there. And then those people would have spread out and started moving around Europe as the ice sheets retreated. Because remember that 15,000 years ago is a time right at the end of the last ice age. And much of Europe would have been covered with glaciers, and those glaciers were now retreating, and so people could spread out around Europe, and they could go north, and they could go east and west. And it's probably the case that in present-day Romania, sometime around 10,000 years ago or 9,000 years ago, that there were languages spoken around present-day Romania that are languages we would now call Indo-European languages. Romanian, as you will know, is an Indo-European language. And it was probably the case that the first Indo-European people would have moved into that part of the world around Romania, maybe sometime around 9,000 to 10,000 years ago. And that corresponds with the invention by human beings of agriculture. We learned how to domesticate plants and animals, and that was a very successful way to live. And so we started to expand and spread out around Western Europe. And so we really don't know very much more than that about what would have been going on in present-day Romania, but probably something like I've described.
But I saw on the internet many trees of languages showing all sorts of connections. Some languages emerge from one another, or they developed in parallel and just borrowed some elements. Others diverge completely. But what can you tell us about the evolution of Romanian language?
Well, as I say, the Romanian language is one of about 100 Indo-European languages. And those Indo-European languages would have started to evolve around 10,000 years ago. And they would have been evolving in parallel with each other over all of Western Europe. And at the same time, other languages would have been evolving in other parts of Europe and Eurasia. So the languages of the Ural Mountains, for example, what we call the Uralic languages that include Finnish and Hungarian, they would have been evolving at the same time in a different part of Europe. But around present-day Romania, maybe 10,000 years ago or so, these Indo-European languages would have been evolving. And present-day Romanian will be a descendant of one of those languages. And there will be some words in Romanian that will have an ancestry that could be traced all the way back to those languages that were spoken perhaps 10,000 years ago. So let me ask a question. What is the Romanian word for the number 2?
Doi.
Exactly. And you can tell that sounds a lot like my English two, or the French deux, or the Spanish dos, or the Dutch tu. And that sound two, or what is it in Romanian again?
Doi.
Doi. You can hear that sound is a very ancient sound that would have been spoken all over Europe 10,000 years ago. And that sound has persisted or descended right the way up through to the present in the contemporary Romanian language.
Yes, but here in Romania are many contradictory opinions. Some say that Romanian language emerged from Latin. Others said no, Latin emerged from that 10,000 years ago old language spoken on our actual territory, or maybe they developed in parallel. What do you think?
Yes. So my understanding of the Romanian language is that it might be the closest living descendant of the Latin languages. Romanian shares many, many words with the Latin languages. And so Romanian, like Italian, is a descendant of these Latin languages. Those Latin languages would have first been spoken maybe 4,000 to 5,000 years ago in and around the part of the world where present-day Romanians and Italians live. And in turn, that language that was spoken maybe 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, it would have been the descendant of languages that were spoken 6, 7, 8, 9, or even 10,000 years ago in Southern Europe. And so indeed, Romanian does trace its ancestry back to Latin, and then even further back to the languages that Latin descended from, the Proto-Indo-European languages.
So our language came from the Proto-European language, and at a certain moment, more recently, Latin emerged from that.
That's exactly correct. That there was this Proto-Indo-European language that is the ancestor of my language, English, your language, Romanian. It's the ancestor of people in India, their language, like Hindi or Punjabi or Sanskrit languages. They're also descendant of Indo-European. But then one particular branch of that language moved forward and became Latin, and then eventually Romanian would descend from that Latin language.
Oh, so it's a double connection.
Yes.
But let me repeat and going into further details. So, first, there were the Proto-Indo-European languages. Then came Latin, but also from the Proto-Indo-European language came that ancient 10,000 years old language spoken on our actual territory, and then Latin language generated the modern day Romanian language.
Yes, so Romanian is a descendant of Latin, and Latin is a descendant of the Proto-Indo-European language. Now, Romanian has some words in it that it has acquired by borrowing from other languages and from some of the Daci words.
Yes.
But the core of Romanian is very much related to the core of Latin. It's a descendant. So in a sense, it's the great-great-great-great-great-grandchild of Latin. And Latin itself is the great-great-great-great-grandchild of Proto-Indo-European.
Can you give me some simple examples?
Well, so, for example, we think that, what is you told me that the Romanian word for the number two is
Doi.
doi, it's thought that the Proto-Indo-European word, which would have existed 10,000 years ago for the number two, is duo. Duo. And that we know in Latin, the word for two was duo, and it's just changed a little bit to doi in Romanian. And you can even hear it in English as two. So you can hear there the line of descent of those languages.
Can you give us some examples of any very ancient words that had been preserved compared to others that had been not preserved or changed due to bad pronunciation?
Well, so for example, in English, the word that I use for water is water. And what is the word for water in Romanian?
Apa.
Aqua.
Apă.
Aqua.
Apa.
And you can hear that it's very much like the Spanish aqua or the Latin agua, but in the language I speak, that word has changed to water. And so there are examples of where we see that different languages over time have changed and acquired new words that are different from the ones that you use. My language, English, is not so closely related to Latin as Romanian is.
Can you present for our viewers the history of human behavior since 15,000 years ago until present day, a more elaborate presentation?
Well, it's what happened was that around 15,000 years ago, as I was saying, we were all hunter-gatherers. And hunter-gatherers, in a sense, don't have very much history in that they simply do the same thing day in and day out. But what happened was about 10,000 years ago, in a region near to modern-day Turkey, and even parts of Iraq, human beings invented agriculture. That's about 10,000 years ago. So 15,000 years ago, we were all hunter-gatherers. About 10,000 years ago, we invented agriculture. And then agriculture, or farming, or keeping of animals, spread out. Those people spread out over all of Western Europe. And those farmers would have moved into what is modern-day Romania, maybe 7 or 8 or 9,000 years ago. And they would have eventually spread all the way through Western Europe, into France and Spain and Italy and what is modern-day Britain. They would have spread to the east all the way into modern-day Russia. And then those farmers bring us right up to the present, because farming then was the way of life for all people in Western Europe, right up until the present.
Please talk about the evolution of cooperation within human groups since then until now.
Well, the remarkable thing about human groups is that, unlike any other animal, humans can cooperate with people outside of their family. If you study most cooperation in the animal world, it's between relatives, brothers or parents and their children or sisters, but it's normally between relatives. But what humans are good at is cooperating and trading and exchanging things with people who aren't necessarily related to them. And that means that we've been able to, you might say, exploit the talents and skills and wisdom and knowledge of vast groups of people. Because if you are good at something that I'm not good at, and I'm good at something that you aren't good at, we can trade what we make and we both profit from it. And that's really been the key to human success, is this ability to cooperate with a wide range of people. Now, what works against that cooperation is our tribalism. At the same time that we try to cooperate, we've often been in competition with other tribes that are trying to occupy the same territory as we do. And so there's been a constant conflict throughout our existence between the benefits we get from trade and exchange versus the difficulties that we get into when we start fighting each other to live in the same territory. And that what's really remarkable about human history is that the more prosperous we are, the more we're able to make things and prosper and acquire objects, the more we have to trade, the less we fight with the people next door. And so really the history of humans in Europe has been one of constant battles and conquests, but at the same time constantly trading. And you can see today that we are living in larger and larger and larger social groups, so that we have towns and villages and cities, but then we have nations, and we even have things above the level of the nation, like the European Union, for example. Romania is a part of the European Union. And these are great big organizations where we try to cooperate with everyone within that organization. So it's very different from the way we were 10,000 years ago, when we might have been competing with small tribes that lived right next door to us.
But there is something very weird. Why we have so many disagreements and wars?
Yes, I mean, humans have always had these two competing forces acting on their behavior. We can either cooperate and get the benefits of trade and exchange, or we can compete, and if we can vanquish or do away with the people who are living next to us, then we can occupy their land and benefit from it. So whenever we encounter other people, we have to weigh up whether it's better to cooperate with them or to fight with them. And unfortunately, what happens is that when we're not very prosperous, when there isn't very much to trade and exchange, there aren't very many jobs to go around, we tend to compete with each other. In times of great prosperity, we tend to cooperate with each other. And so one of the things we see happening right now, for example, in the Ukraine, is that there's very difficult financial and political times, and people are tending to fight with each other rather than cooperate. And this is really a response to a shortage of goods and services and jobs and technologies and so on. So that's really been the history of humanity for many, many thousands of years.
Yes, but even the history had been used to create premeditated wars. This is our land, we were here first.
Yes, that's right. I mean, humans are people who cooperate to a great extent with other members of their tribe, but it seems they're quite willing to throw down their ethics and morality when it comes to members of other tribes. And so one of the great sort of conflicts or paradoxes about humans is that we think that killing and murder is the worst thing we can do, and yet if we kill or murder somebody from a different tribe, we sometimes give people our highest military honors for that. And so humans have evolved this ability, sadly, to be very violent and aggressive species. And the way we tame those aggressive instincts are through cooperation and prosperity. If we can do better from cooperating than we can by fighting, we'll cooperate. But if the benefits of cooperation drain away, then we often resort to fighting. And that's why humans are so tribal and territorial. It's been a big, big part of our past.
How would you see any possible biological determinism in this regard? Are we biologically determined?
Well, it's very difficult to answer a question like that, but there's probably a great deal of genetic influence on just very broadly our behaviors, not determined in any sense, in that, as I've been explaining, depending upon the nature of the environment we're living in, we can either be highly cooperative or highly competitive and aggressive. And so our behavior isn't determined by genes, but the very broad strategies that we use might somehow be influenced by our genes.
I had just read on the internet that other authors have slightly different approach. For example, Richard Sennett,
Yes.
he emphasizes cooperation as a personal craft.
Yes, I think when he says that, what he means is that learning how to cooperate takes a lot of practice, and in that sense, cooperation becomes a craft. It isn't something that's easy to know how to do, because cooperation really is all about learning how to trade and exchange and negotiate what your value is and recognize somebody else's value. And so in that sense, it's a craft. But that doesn't mean that we can ignore genes. It's our genes that give us the ability to do those things. And we know that because we're the only species that does it. If cooperation like we do was purely a craft, we could teach it to other animals. But the way that humans are able to cooperate with other people and learn how to trade and exchange things, that's something that only we do.
Can you tell us more about our people regarding the evolution of languages and behavior?
About Romanians?
Yes.
Uh,
From Dacia, from Dacians?
Well, I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that, other than what I've told you. I really don't know. What I can say is that much of Western Europe is genetically, we're all really quite similar. On the other hand, we can see that people have tended to stay put, so that we can see genetic profiles that differ between people, whether they live in the far west of Europe or the north of Europe or the south of Europe or the far east of Europe. But those genetic differences are probably not very important for what we're like. They're simply markers of where we've lived and where our ancestry is from.
I wish to present you a quote from another interview, and please listen few seconds and then comment about that.
Now, last July 2013, I was really pleased beyond words to see the publication of a huge study that was done by Professor Mark Pagels, Pagels, at the University of Reading, just north of London. And Mark Pagels and his team, after a colossal amount of work, trying to define the roots of what's technically called the PIE, the Proto-Indo-European language. They managed to isolate the origins of that language, which lies behind all, by the way, languages on Earth, not just the modern European languages. They managed to locate the center of that where the ice sheets didn't quite come down fully, and that's in Romania and northern Bulgaria. Bulgaria is immediately to the south of your country, at least it was the last time I was there, and that is where the ice sheets didn't come down. So the ancient language, which had come from India in countless centuries prior to 15,000 BC, when the ice sheets started to retreat, the language survived there.
Please make a comment.
Well, first, it's very nice that this gentleman has read our work. Just a couple of corrections.
Yes.
The proto-language that was spoken 15,000 years ago isn't the ancestor of all languages on Earth, but it is the ancestor of all of the languages spoken around Europe and Eurasia. So the big landmass we call Eurasia. And it probably did originate, as we've been discussing, in an area not too far from present-day Romania. And then it will be the ancestor of all of these languages. And then Proto-Indo-European would have been a descendant of that language that existed 15,000 years ago. Proto-Indo-European probably arose about 10,000 years ago. And then as we were discussing, the sort of Proto-Latin was maybe 5,000 years ago. And then Romanian itself is sometime, we know, within the last 2,000 years. Something like that.
Can you tell us more about what would be the next step in this amazing scientific study that you started?
One of the things we would like to try to understand is whether we can go even further back in time than 15,000 years. We think it's going to be very, very difficult to do that, but we'd like to look for links between the languages of Eurasia and maybe the languages of the Middle East and then Africa, because we think that human beings migrated out of Africa up through the Middle East and then eventually into Europe. And so we'd like to see if we can find links between these languages of Europe and the languages outside of Europe.
Would you be interested to publish your books in Romania?
I would be delighted if my book were to be published in Romanian. Absolutely delighted. It has been published in Italian, and so it would be delightful to see it published in Romanian.
Can you tell us about the opinion and impressions that other scientists have about your work?
I think that for anthropologists who adopt an evolutionary perspective on human beings, my book has been well received. There are other people who study humans who are not so comfortable with the idea that our behaviors are influenced by our genes, and those people are less comfortable with my book. But I think the ideas of language and tribalism and so on are and cooperation have been very well received.
Yes, this tiny detail that you mentioned is very important because some scientists spoke about the role and the differences between memes and genes.
Yes, I mean, of course, genes we understand and we know about. You could say memes, the flow of ideas from one mind to another, is really what modern humans have done so well. That's what social learning is. We learn from each other, we adopt each other's ideas, we adopt each other's technologies and skills and so on. And it's that ability to evolve our cultures at the level of ideas that really sets us apart from the other animals. All the other animals can evolve genetically, like us, but only we evolve at the level of our ideas. And a really nice way of thinking about this is that you and I are stuck with the genes that our parents gave to us, but of course, throughout our lives, we can select from a whole sea of evolving ideas. So the ideas that we use and make use of have changed very much throughout our lives, whereas our genes haven't. So our ideas and thus our cultures evolve very rapidly, whereas our genes evolve very slowly. And this has meant that our cultures can respond and adapt much more quickly than our genes can.
Can you tell us how was possible that the belief in supernatural beings came into our existence so long time ago, and what were the reasons of that at that time, and why we are still keeping it right now in our modern times?
This is a very, very fascinating question, and I think we can only speculate about a lot of things about humans, but one of the things that we know is true of humans is that we are the only animal, at least as far as we know, that can wonder about its own existence. We can wonder why we are alive and why we are here. And that instantly makes us wonder if there's something that created us. we're also perhaps the only animal that can worry about the future, and that makes us realize that the world can be a very unpredictable and unforgiving place. And if you put those two things together, that we can wonder about our own existence and we can worry about the future, then it almost becomes natural for us to wonder if there is some creature or other being, like a God, that created us and that can control our environment. And so if we think of early human beings wandering around as hunter-gatherers, wondering about how they could make the rain stop, or wondering how they could perhaps find more food, something like that, it became almost natural for them to wonder if they could somehow please a God and that would make their lives better. Again, because we can wonder about why we exist, what it might be like if we were to die. We can wonder about why the world is the way it is. And so religion becomes a very natural part of our psychological experience. And it could be that having religious beliefs has somehow made it easier for us to live in a very unpredictable and unforgiving world. And that could be why religion is such a natural psychological characteristic of all human societies.
Yes, but also religion created many wars.
And then, of course, my God is different from your God. My tribe has a different religion from your tribe. And those two gods send us to war with each other. And so religion is another one of these aspects of the human species that is both perhaps very reassuring and helpful for us within our societies, but can lead us into greater conflict between societies.
Dear Professor Mark Pagel, I thank you a lot for this presentation and for helping us to review our history lessons, research, and I'm sure your words will be very appreciated. I was even suggested that if you may agree to visit Romania for some lectures, conferences, and publish your book in Romanian language.
Well, thank you very much. It's been my pleasure. And if I were ever invited to Romania, I would do what I could to come along and give some lectures.
Okay, I thank you again, and I hope that you agree to have a second meeting, maybe later this year, for more about all these topics that we had just briefly discussed today.
Okay. Thank you very much, Cristian. It's been a pleasure.
For me too. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Ce concluzii putem desprinde? Afirmațiile domnului Mitchell Leduit au anumite erori și nu întâmplător am difuzat acel serial cu avertismentele necesare. Însă, cu toate acestea, nu putem spune că am ajuns la capătul unui drum și că cercetarea profesorului Pagel a lămurit totul. Dimpotrivă, ea este doar la început. Ea a deschis un drum care așteaptă să fie parcurs. Așa că cel mai mult mi-aș dori, înainte de orice altceva, să se poată soluționa controversele exagerate care continuă să persiste în media din România. Limba română a început să se formeze după războaiele daco-romane și mai ales după retragerea aureliană din anul 271. Limba română s-a format dintr-un dialect de latină vulgară cu câteva cuvinte dacice. Formarea ei a continuat pe vremea popoarelor migratoare și s-a finalizat oarecum în ultimele secole din mileniul I, odată cu influența slavă. Renumitul profesor de lingvistică, cu o specializare în slavistică la Universitatea din Cracovia, Ioan Pătruț, tatăl lui Adrian Pătruț, a demonstrat faptul că influența slavă este mai mică decât se credea și ea nu apare în construcția limbii române, care se încheiase deja prin secolele 6-8. Până la el se afirmase că formarea limbii române s-a încheiat doar în secolul X cu o influență slavă majoră. Deci, latina are la bază grupul proto-indo-european, la fel ca și limbile tracice, după cum se bănuiește, din care ar fi făcut parte și getodaca. Limba română este la fel de apropiată de latină ca și italiana de azi. Originea sa îndepărtată însă în grupul indo-european se datorează filiației latine. De altfel, majoritatea limbilor care se vorbesc azi în Europa au rădăcini primare în grupul de limbi indo-europene sau chiar proto-indo-europene. Aceste informații deosebit de utile mi-au fost oferite de către profesorul Adrian Pătrus, căruia îi mulțumesc și îl așteptăm cât de curând la o discuție în serial pe aceste teme și nu numai. Citesc cu mult interes întrebările și comentariile dumneavoastră pentru a pune bazele următoarei întâlniri cu profesorul de istorie Mark Pagel. Dar așa cum tocmai am precizat mai devreme, vom avea și discuții cu specialiști clujeni. Fiți alături de noi data viitoare la o nouă întâlnire cu Știință și Cunoaștere.